And let me call to the stage Jordan Lipchuk from Radicle. I love the name, so I want to hear more about the story. So over to you.
Appreciate everybody's time and energy now for putting this together, and hopefully able to add significant value as we kind of walk through a little bit of the carbon markets and how people can monetize emission reductions and help pay for all this sustainability and decarbonization that is in front of us. So first, a quick little background on Radicle. We helped found the carbon markets and carbon offsets back in 2008, particularly in the Alberta market. But since then have expanded into many different voluntary and compliance markets around the world, fully integrated. So we work with the upfront, initial technical consulting, how to write these protocols, work with regulators or different compliance markets and figuring out how to monetize emission reductions. Project development, actually developing and serializing and verifying carbon credits, and then trading. We've got a global trade desk that's traded about half $500 million in environmental commodities. So we really focus on trying to not only decarbonize the industry and become leaders, not only in oil and gas, but all types of energy, biofuels, electricity, renewables, and all sorts of different types of low carbon fuels like hydrogen. So I'm going to dive into a little bit of a general overview of the emission markets for people that don't know them yet, or maybe just getting into this sort of first step of sustainability or ESG and wondering how to pay for all these things. So emission markets were sort of created by putting a price on carbon, and they're meant for organizations that have either made a pledge to net zero, and they've done as many emission reductions as they can, and they've greened their supply chain. But there's always going to be that little bit left, and so you'd often go to the market and buy a carbon offset to offset that last bit of emission reductions. In compliance markets, is sort of laid out in this slide. You're set sort of a baseline or an allocated emission units where you can't go over that. If you go over it, you're hit with sort of a compliance fine or tax. And then if you're under it or able to get under the line, you're able to get a credit. So there's some, for instance, maybe a large refinery or manufacturing facility that's kind of at the end of life. There's no real point in maybe retrofitting that, but there's a newer facility that's right at that line and can do a little bit more to actually get underneath that line and can sell that emission reduction or those credits to the larger companies so they can then come compliant. And that's how the whole system sort of works. There's two different types of these systems, as I was explaining. Compliance markets. So if you're in Canada, specifically in Alberta, you're very familiar with these compliance markets, and they're sort of legislated carbon markets. And then there's voluntary markets that are primarily driven by net zero and ESG initiatives. And as we transition and as we decarbonize, these things, they're not only coming, but they're here now. And over the next 7 to 10, 15 years, this is going to create winners and losers. And the winners are going to be able to reduce emissions and costs. They're going to be able to participate in these markets and generate new revenues. But the biggest thing is going to be managing that risk. And there's significant risk within ESG and carbon markets, not only greenwashing and that more reputational risk we talk about, but significant financial risk. If we're not calculating in the price of carbon into your ROIs and into your business, if you're a high carbon intensity, it's going to get very difficult to operate and be profitable over the next 7 years. Additionally, making sure you're getting the right carbon credits, compliance grade carbon credits, whether they're voluntary. There's a lot of different options coming available, and some of those we would definitely recommend staying away from and really focusing on the high quality sort of markets and carbon credits, because there are a lot of risk when you kind of get into the fringes there. So real quick, what's the difference? What's a carbon offset? What are these low carbon fuel markets? A carbon offset is 1 metric ton of CO2. A couple things about it. It has to be real and additional. It's got to be above and beyond the regular course of business. It's got to be permanent, verifiable, and quantifiable. So we've got to be able to measure it. And ownership is a big thing. Often a lot of technology companies come to us and say, hey, we want to monetize these emission reductions. We sell this equipment that reduces emissions by X. It's actually the owner who's purchasing that equipment and who's putting it on their facility. The owner of the land often holds the rights to the environmental commodities. These markets, whether they're voluntary, is global, but you're seeing compliance markets pop up, all over the world. Radicle focuses on a number of specific protocols or recipes. Sort of how I refer to them, they're the specific project types that would be eligible to create carbon offsets and monetize those emission reductions. And you can see Alberta up here as one of the first actually industrial compliance markets that started back in 2008. So we were actually quite lucky in Alberta as a lot of these compliance markets are popping up, and then including industrials, we're able to take that expertise into those markets as well. Speaking of Alberta, there are some current protocols that many organizations are taking advantage of that we're helping out. Our oil and gas sector in Alberta is responsible for 28% of all carbon offsets created in this market. So we're doing our part. The three main protocols I just wanted to talk about that we're offering now to organizations to help monetize is instrument gas to instrument air, solar chemical pump conversions, and vent gas reductions on tanks. And so these are three protocols that we're specifically pursuing now in Alberta, but we've got dozens of other project types that we're pursuing internationally as well. Low carbon fuels. So that's very similar. It's a carbon scheme, but it's also very, very different. We don't create carbon offsets when you're in a low carbon fuel market. You create these low carbon fuel certificates, and it's based off of, rather than 1 ton of CO2, it's based off of grams of CO2 per megajoule, which is a carbon intensity. And this is where you have to have a little bit more of analysis and actually get like an LCA done. But there's also significant opportunities in these markets where these credits can trade for 5, 10 times, even more what a carbon offset trades at. And basically there's this baseline diesel and gasoline, and we want to create lower carbon intensity fuels. So for instance, in BC that has a renewable grid, electricity is a very viable option. We're also talking about biofuels and hydrogen and other types of low carbon fuels that are eligible for these types of carbon offsets, low carbon fuel credits. These carbon markets or the low carbon fuel markets, started sort of in California and BC, but as you can see, it's now rolling out federally across Canada. 2 new markets just started in Washington and Oregon, and these are legislated, coming in this fall. This is happening, and they're quite material. Both the potential risks, the stick, and then the carrot. The carrot can be quite lucrative for the right types of opportunities. 3 ways to generate, LCFS credits is to sort of produce a low carbon transportation fuel, installing EV chargers and hydrogen fueling, and electrification of material handling or commercial fleet vehicles. And so these are specific project types that we're helping organizations with. You've got to measure it and verify it in a certain way. You got to adhere to the GHG protocol. So it is a quite complex process, but this is growing. Right now, you're seeing these markets, even just over the last 3-4 years have kind of gone, I think 3 to 5x. And, over the next 7 to 10 years, we're seeing not only are some of these legislated to grow, and but also just due to the net zero commitments, the price of carbon is expected to grow, and these markets are expected to grow. And so happy to talk a little bit more. Radicle is really excited to be able to take to these markets and sort of democratize carbon credits and carbon offsets for all types of organizations and organizations of different shapes and sizes. So appreciate everybody's time today, and happy to answer any questions on carbon markets or how we actually go about doing this.
Thanks, Jordan. Actually, there are questions. I've got one. You touched on some of the risks, but you've been vague as to what the exact risks are. I wonder if you could just unpack that a bit. What are the risks that companies are going to face stepping into this?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, if you buy in the voluntary market and you've made a commitment to a net zero, if you're buying, low quality carbon offsets, you leave certain exposure up to greenwashing, and there's a lot of reputational risks that could happen if you're either unaware or not experienced or don't have the expertise in this market. There are a lot of potential traps or major risks in participating in a market and purchasing the wrong ones.
Yeah, things like a double counting risk, I suspect. I've claimed a forest and you've claimed the forest. Well, we both can't claim the same forest.
And that's why you'll want to generally work with a project developer. And then on the compliance side, if you don't measure or quantify or have the right emission factor, and you produced either too many carbon credits or double counting, these are now considerable financial risks where these can be backdated, and you'll actually have to remove these from the registry, and it's quite a process.
Yeah, it gets ugly quick. Jordan, this has been fascinating. Thank you very much for sharing this with me us today. I'll turn this back now to Dan.